Good afternoon. Good afternoon and welcome to the Sheen Center Online. I'm David DeSerto, Interim Executive Director. The Archbishop Fulton J. Sheen through the arts and thoughtful discourse. And today's conversation is part of our ongoing free public content that we're offering while we can't gather together in person down at the Sheen Center. As always, we ask that you like us, subscribe to our Sheen Talks YouTube channel, and go ahead and click that bell icon so you can be notified of upcoming videos. Today, we have a real special treat. This is an event that I've been really looking forward to for some time. In celebration of Black History Month, we will explore the life and legacy of sculptor Edmonia Lewis, a woman of color and a Catholic whose remarkable personal triumph is as amazing as the exquisite works of art she created. Serving as our virtual docent is world-class Rome-based art historian and dear friend of the Sheen Center, Dr. Elizabeth Lev. Dr. Lev's most recent book, How Catholic Art Saved the Faith, from Sophia Press, a really wonderful read, identifies two roles that art should serve in the classical Catholic understanding of the arts. And those roles are to teach and to delight. And when talking about art, I can think of few people who can do those two things better than Dr. Elizabeth Lev. So without further ado, I welcome Dr. Lev.
Thank you. That is the loveliest introduction. And I'm sorry I can't be with you there tonight, although in all honesty, after hearing about your snow, I may be glad that I'm here in beautiful Rome. And as a matter of fact, that's kind of the approach I want to take tonight with you. I was hoping I could take you on a little tour is my plan. And the plan is to show you Rome, but not Rome exactly the way we know it today. Rome from many years ago, Rome from basically 1850 to 1880. And I am momentarily having difficulty sharing my screen, which is a little disconcerting. And I hope that indeed you are hearing me, because I am seeing nothing but a not responding message.
Hi, Dr. Lev. We can certainly see you and hear you. If you're experiencing some difficulties with your PowerPoint.
David, can you hear me?
I sure can. Can you hear me? Can you hear me now,
I
Dr.
have nothing on the screen.
Okay. We're experiencing some technical difficulties, as we often do in these live events. So let me see if we can ask Dr. Lev to try exiting and coming back on. So if you bear with us a moment, we'll try to resolve these technical issues, and we'll be coming right back to you. Okay, hopefully we're trying to resolve the issue. There we are.
This is classic Roman technology. I feel like this is very, very appropriate. It feels like I'm getting my Lent a day early. So I am sorry for the delay. I am going to start right up again. And as I was saying, I don't know if you could hear me or not, but what I was trying to tell you is that I wanted to take you on a tour. And I was thinking, wouldn't it be fun to kind of look at Rome, not from the point of view as when you get off the plane at Fiumicino and you got on a tour bus, but I want to take you on the Roman tour of the mid-19th century, the days when Harriet Beecher Stowe and Frederick Douglass and Isabella Stewart Gardner and Mark Twain and Teddy Roosevelt and so many others made their way to Rome. And what did they go see? Well, they went to go see the most typically fascinating things, the Colosseum, still not fully excavated yet. They went to go see the Piazza Navona, to be seen and to see and be seen. They enjoyed the Forum before they walked down to the Tiber, which didn't have embankments yet, and they would catch a pedestrian boat to go over to the Vatican, where they would have the possibility maybe of seeing then Pope Pius IX, who would be holding an audience shortly before the unification of Italy, and he would be closed inside the Vatican until his death in 1878. So if you were taking your tour, you would see these places, but there were a few other places that the great American tourists like to visit. And those were the famous studios of the great sculptors who had set up shop in the Eternal City. Sculptors like Thomas Crawford, like William Wetmore Story, who had a fabulous place in the Palazzo Barberini. So you would go to visit these modern sculptors and perhaps bring home something a little special to remember your trip. But there was one studio, a studio that was the most fascinating of them all. And it was right off the Piazza Barberini, where you could go and visit the studio of Edmonia Wildfire Lewis. She was the African-American sculptor working in the city of Rome. She was the toast of the town, a fascinating figure that brought many, many people to go and visit her studio. So this is kind of part of this American experience in Rome, and not just American, but it was part of the American experience in Rome to go around to all of these studios. And one of these studios in the 1860s to the 1870s was run by this incredibly successful woman of color who had up to sometimes would have a number of assistants, 5 assistants working underneath her. So we ask ourselves this question: who is this Edmonia Lewis? And a big part of this presentation tonight is part of an ongoing effort by a number of people who I'll be talking about at the end, who have been trying to get this incredible woman noticed. And so when we talk about who was she, I was inspired thinking about this question by one of the people who have written about Edmonia Lewis, who is Kirsten Pye Buick. And she brought up an interesting question. I've written a biography of a woman, and I realized when you write these biographies of historical women, we use this verb to be, which in Italian would be stare, and it's something very static. So there's an aspect of these lives when you talk about the biographical story, it sounds very static. So she was born on July 4th of 1844. She's the daughter of an African-American and Native-American mother and a Haitian father. She was the younger sister of a man named Solomon Lewis. She was orphaned at the age of 9. She was taken in by her Native American relatives. She was accepted at Oberlin. She was wrongfully accused at Oberlin. She was defended by Langton Mercer. She was beaten to within an inch of her life, and she was counseled to move east. So we have this was. But what I want to talk to you about tonight is, what did she do? And this is a woman who studied drawing, and she survived that humiliation and the accusations and the beating. She mastered media perception. She pursued her dream of sculpting. She moved to Europe. She carved marble. She molded clay. She converted to Catholicism. She ran a business. She promoted American culture abroad. She competed in the international art market. She won prizes. She interpreted biblical, literary, and contemporary histories in a unique way. She broke barriers, and she challenged her viewers. This is the person I want you to meet tonight. So let's start out with this just first background of a woman whose background is a little bit tricky. And it's because our biographical information is sometimes a little contradictory. And I'm going to explain to you in a little while that that actually makes a lot of sense when you look in the great history of the most famous artists of the history of art. You find that there are occasionally an interesting construction of one's autobiography. But at any rate, we have that she's born around Greenbush in upstate New York on July 4th, which is such a happy date. She was orphaned at the age of 9, and she traveled for a few years with her mother's people. And you see this sort of train of motion as she's moving around upstate New York and a little bit into Canada. Her brother, her older brother, stepped in to see to her education. So from 1856 to 1858, we find her beginning her education at McGrawville before she went to Oberlin in 1859, where she stayed until 1864. And there she learned, she was receiving a good education as an educator. There is a very well-known story that she suffered an accusation by 2 young white women who accused her of poisoning them with Spanish fly. During the time that they were waiting for her trial, she was kidnapped from her house and she was beaten so badly that she appeared to her court at a court case on crutches. And even though she was acquitted, a little while later, she was accused of something else. She was accused of stealing, and it became very apparent that staying in Oberlin was not a good solution for her. And so she was counseled by none other than Frederick Douglass to go east. Now, the interesting thing is we know about this trauma that happened in Oberlin, but what I want to talk about is the door that opened. And the door that opened is a young woman who was able to take a pencil and paper in hand and begin to draw, to begin to see in her mind and express on paper the first steps of artistry. And I think this is the earliest work of art extant from Edmonia Lewis. And I think it's fascinating to look at this drawing of it's the Muse Urania. But what I find fascinating about it is that it's a drawing after a sculpture. The images of that muse are always made in sculptural form. So it's fascinating to see in this work the seedling of what would become the woman who would be a sculptor. You can already see that interest in the round. So what I'm saying is that she didn't take a pencil and paper and start drawing a landscape or a haystack, or she drew something that was solid and it was 3-dimensional. She took the advice of Frederick Douglass and she went east. She went east to Boston. And yes, the reason why there's a heart around Boston is because I'm from there. And there she discovered the incredibly active abolition movement that was happening in Boston. And she was taken in and assisted immediately by 2 people, Lydia Marie Child and William Lloyd Garrison, 2 people who really gave their entire lives to the abolition of slavery. And in the case of William Lloyd Garrison, he risked his life in the attempt to bring about the end of slavery. And so she, first of all, has this contact with these people who are utterly committed to this equality. And then what's more interesting is that these people are using means of communication in order to enlighten the public. So William Garrison was the publisher of a newspaper called The Liberator, and it was an anti-slavery paper that week after week, after issue, brought out the wrongs and the evils of slavery. Lydia Marie Child, also a very accomplished writer and author, used interviews, also used the media. They were using the media to change hearts and minds. And so that's going to be another very important lesson that she absorbs in this very early phase of her life. But one of the most important things that happened when she arrived in the city of Boston is that she saw the 8-foot tall statue by William Greenough of Benjamin Franklin sitting in front of the Boston Latin School, not too far from the offices of William Garrison. And seeing that sculpture, seeing something that made present the power of sculpture to make a person present, a hero present, someone who is no longer here, but stands larger than life, become good weather, bad weather, standing there. She too wanted to speak in that particular medium, even more than the medium of speaking or the medium of writing. The medium that spoke to her, the medium that called her, the medium that she wanted to communicate through was sculpture. So imagine this. A woman of color, a young 20-year-old girl, fresh out of these problems in Oberlin, who dreams, who sees, wants to become a sculptor. But in Boston, it was possible to find someone to teach her. And so she taught someone who was no stranger to controversies himself, to controversial situations himself. Edward Brackett, who was a New England sculptor, had come to fame in the 1850s with a sculpture that people found quite shocking, the scene of the shipwrecked mother and child, and this very disturbing representation of the nude. So he was someone who was used to trying to provoke his viewers. And in turn, he started by assisting Edmonia. I was kind of the hard school of art, sort of giving her something to model, a foot to model, hands to model, really learning with this hands-on craft. She was in a hurry. She was very eager to start to set up shop, and her brother helped her so that within just a year or so, she was able to set up her own shingle. And she began to recognize how important the presentation of herself was going to be, obviously with friends like Lydia Child, friends like William Garrison, and her own desire to work in a medium, to work in art, and art is communication. So she begins to craft her story. She begins to construct the biography or the points that she wants to bring out of the biography of Edmonia Lewis. And the reason why I think this is important is to understand that great artists all do this. Michelangelo is notorious for doing this. So we have, first of all, this proclamation of being the other. I have not a single drop of what is white blood in my veins. My father was a full-blooded Negro and my mother was a full-blooded Chippewa. So she immediately pulls herself out of the group. She's someone who's completely apart and begins to form her persona as someone who's not going to be blending in, not going to be doing things the way other people do them. And then this amazing line that she also gives to Lydia Child, that she doesn't want to be praised for her color. She doesn't want that kind of praise. I'd rather you point out my defects, for that will teach me something. And again, I just want to point out that there's a lot of conversation about how much she actually likes that criticism, but I think that's true of all of us. But I think it's very important to realize that she's putting forward someone who wants to be established. This is her voice. The voice that she's bringing out to the public is someone who wants to be established. Look at me on my merits. Look at how I'm sculpting. And so we see this kind of interesting way of constructing her story. She talks about this, time she spends wandering in the wilderness, and her life in life with the fresh water and the fresh fish, and this construction of the public persona that will be Edmonia Lewis. And as I've been saying, Michelangelo was very attentive to every word that was ever written about him, and he created a persona which was Michelangelo. Caravaggio created the persona that was Caravaggio, and it's part of this persona of the artist. I think she's very capable of understanding that in the history of art, we have this concept of the artist who is born under Saturn, this idea of the artist who is a kind of contemplative, solitary other who from the outside looks in. I think it's a very interesting part of her very early, she's very young, already constructing this persona. Now, this interest in creating sculptures for Edmonia started out as an interest in bringing to life heroes. People loved images of people that they admired. And so we already had Edward Brackett, who had been making sculptures of the great abolitionist, the famous abolitionist John Brown. And so Edmonia began to create these little models and medallions, things that were meant to be for sale. She was looking for independence. And so even though she had plenty of people who put up subscriptions for her and people who tried to help her economically. We see a very determined woman who does not want to be dependent on the money of others. She wants to earn her own money. And so we find immediately after she opens the studio, she too is making little medallions and models of John Brown, which can be sold. And so this streak of independence is in some ways begins to bring her into conflict with Lydia Marie Child, who has been her great benefactor. She makes more of these models and busts, and things kind of come to a head with Lydia Childs over a bust of Robert Gould Shaw, which was made in 1964. Now, Robert Gould Shaw was a member of the Massachusetts militia, and he led an all-Black regiment into the Civil War, where they all died. And there's been memory of him coming through the city of Boston, this sort of hero who is, by the way, known personally to many of Edmonia's benefactors in this sort of dramatic, heroic death. Edmonia really wanted to make an image to remember him. Lydia did not want the image made, and they gave her trouble in getting images or photographs that she could work from so that she could model it. And she ultimately had to turn to the family who gave her photographs. It's very interesting to see in this work. We see the clothed version of Charles Sumner on the right, but this nude, which is an allusion to divinity, this kind of thing that we see in Roman art, this idea of this heroic nude. So we see this man who's been killed, and we see him sort of elevated iconographically to sort of the status of a demigod, but of course not in the sense that people believe in him as a god, but in the sense of this kind of idealized iconic type of status, which is a very common thing in classical art. And so she ran into serious conflict with Lydia Marie Child at this point, who writes to a friend of hers about how she was very disappointed to see the work. And as a matter of fact, the version that she had, she cut away the bust because she thought it was disproportionate. And she basically panned the statue. And I think it's interesting to see the two reactions to the same work here. So we have Lydia Marie Child, who talks about how she really didn't want Edmonia, who was not very experienced, to make this statue and to trod on her personal feelings towards this hero. She thought she wasn't ready, thought the sculpture didn't come out well. Then we have Anna Quincy Watterson, who's a poetess, who writes a poem in honor of the same sculpture. So we see that Edmonia is going to be a figure that's going to create some division. There are people who are going to have very, very different feelings about it. And so eventually the main reluctance of Lydia Child is that she doesn't think that Edmonia should be working in stone. And sort of there's this kind of almost unfortunate commentary on the part of Lydia Child, where she says, well, maybe she could, carve some stuff in wood, or maybe make some stuff in stucco for interior decorators. So, I think a lot of Caravaggio, who comes to Rome, and he's essentially a fruit and flower painter, and they keep telling him, well, you should probably just be doing some of the fruit and flowers over in these other paintings in the corner. And Caravaggio, all he wants to do is paint a big old history painting in a church, and he has to fight his way for it. And so I hear this, Edmonia, you should be working in wood, you should be working in stucco, maybe you could, and just this belittling of the potential of her talent. And yet she so desperately really wants to work in this great medium, the medium that was it is the medium since Greece for great sculpture. And I'm going to point out something that I think is kind of interesting about this. And I don't want to accuse Lydia Child of this. I think Lydia Child perhaps just thought that she was going too fast and really wanted to see her evolve. And if there were some famous artist that might take notice of her and say, well, maybe you should work in marble. I don't think Lydia Marie Child really wanted to keep her down so terribly. But I do think it's interesting to realize that there was, even among the people who supported abolition, a belief that a person of color could be an educator, could be a preacher. She could go to Oberlin and learn how to read and write to go teach freed slaves how to read and write. There was a possibility of being a great orator. They thought of, speech as a wonderful outlet. But there was a sense of entering into that golden circle of the fine arts, painting, sculpture, architecture, that was reserved. That was something that was meant for another type of person. And it's very disconcerting to see. I have a quote here from Thomas Jefferson. It's from the Notes on the State of Virginia in 1787, where he says, "Never yet could I find that a Black has uttered a thought above the level of plain narration, never saw an elementary trait of painting or sculpture." And so there's this tremendous sense of for Edmonia to try to prove that she can speak in this language. It's like saying you can't put together more than a simple sentence, so make stucco, make something simple. But Edmonia knows that she can communicate in this great language, and she's looking for an opportunity to do so. As a matter of fact, in her own words, she says that she wants to do something for the race, something that will excite the admiration of the other races on earth. And that is when she makes the trip to Rome. She sold the copies of the medallions. She made money. She was given some scholarship money, and she made her way across the Atlantic all the way to the city of Rome. City of Florence is where she first ended up. And there she joined that strange sisterhood. This is how it was described by Henry James. Not very nice description. That strange sisterhood of American lady sculptors who at one time settled upon the 7 hills in a white Mormorian flock. And then he mentions that there was one girl among them who was set apart because she was of color, and that he suggests that she got commissions simply because of her color. So she finds a little bit of those, she finds some of those vestiges of that kind of discrimination even when she gets to Rome. But primarily she finds Rome as a place of great opportunity. So one of the things she understood very quickly was to create an image for herself. And now I think, I want to point out a little something. I'm an expat to Rome too. I came from Boston, like Edmonia, to Rome about maybe 30 years ago. And when I first discovered this woman, it was really an amazing thing. She's been she's been not only inspiration for me, but she's also been illumination for me. She makes me understand, looking at my own life as an expat in this city, a little bit about how we do things and why we do things. So one of the things, if you're looking at these 3 photographs, she has her photograph taken a great deal. So she's very good. Again, she understands the importance of publicity. She understands the importance of giving interviews. She understands the importance of putting forth this unusually piquant, beautiful little face, but also the idea of, as one admirer said, those little hands taking a hammer and chisel to carve marble. And she comes up with this kind of crazy uniform. So she wears this funny little sort of pseudo fez hat. She wears a little tie, and she has these kind of funky little jackets. And I'm saying that because usually a lot of us expats, we kind of have funny little uniforms that we wear around here. We have sort of funny little looks. We don't look quite Italian. We don't look quite American. We have our own little look when we're traveling around the city. And it has something to do with being in this culture where it's very clear to everybody around that we're not Italian. The minute we open our mouths, or even the way we look, everybody can spot an American a mile away. African-American, not African-American, people spot Americans a mile away. So you're always somebody. You're always not one of them. And so you begin to kind of develop your own little persona. And I think it's very interesting when I saw how consciously Edmonia did. It was very interesting to me to think about how indeed we do that, we expats here. So she wanted to comment. So that said, said, Edmonia was interested in commenting and producing and talking about her American experience. So she's not going to Italy trying to be an Italian. She's going to Italy as an American who is living in Italy. And so she comes there with this vision of how to express herself and what she's going to say in this culture. So she talks about how wonderful Rome was, how liberating it was. She says she was practically driven to Rome in order to obtain opportunities for art and culture and find a social atmosphere. I was not constantly reminded of my color. And again, that has a lot to do with being an expat, because you're simply not a Roman. So if you're not a Roman, it doesn't really matter what you are, because you're not Roman. The Romans have been this way since the time of, the Gracchi in the 3rd century BC, so they haven't changed much. The first image that she wants to talk about, because she's arriving in Rome shortly after the Emancipation Proclamation, and she finds out that Italy was very, very interested in the fate of slavery in the United States. There are many Italians who were incredibly sympathetic with the abolition movement, the Italians who were following it closely. Plays had been put on to sort of celebrate the great. As a matter of fact, Uncle Tom's Cabin had been produced as an Italian play to kind of rail against the evils of slavery. So she comes there, she herself, who knows about she knows the life of the United States. She expresses, she becomes the channel, the conduit through which one can think about what emancipation means to the Black people of America. And so she produced first one statue, which was a woman hearing the Morning of Freedom, a woman hearing of her freedom for the first time, which ended up being lost and completely panned by Lydia Child. And then she produced this work, this little work, which is called Forever Free. In fact, you can see it's written on the very bottom there. It's, of course, from the last line of the Emancipation Proclamation. And these statuettes, these little kind of, not life size, but really just a little over a foot or little over under 2 feet tall, this little statuette of a man and a woman grouped together. And as an art historian, it's very interesting to see how she works on these grouping questions, because when you're working on sculpture, kind of making the figures fit together is a complicated thing. And it's interesting that she starts from the very beginning, not doing single figures, but she's interested in doing these paired or grouping figures. And she creates these very lovely contrasts. So you have the figure of the man whose bonds are broken. You can see the manacle of his wrist is broken and the manacles around his ankles are broken. And he stands with his arm protectively around the woman who is kneeling underneath him. And this has been occasionally critiqued. It's often our sort of 21st century mentality of critiquing. This has often been critiqued as a work in which you see her kind of alluding to this sort of woman being subjugated. But it's actually a very interesting way of talking about several aspects. She's drawing out several different aspects of the emancipation question. One is this idea of a man who is able to finally protect his family. So instead of having families sold and separated, this is a man who can now be there and protect his own family. But more importantly, if you look at the image of the liberator here, I'm sorry I can't get a better picture for you, but at the cover of the Liberator here, you have a standing man and a seated woman with 2 children. He indicates upwards, she's sitting downwards. So we already see that this grouping was produced in the Liberator, but most importantly, the female figure who is kneeling is a figure who is praying. And again, this idea of this incredibly important role that Christianity played in abolition. The people like Lydia Childs or William Garrison or Charles Sumner or these people were motivated by deep Christian faith. Harriet Beecher Stowe, deep Christian faith in equality. And this is something that's not glossed over or hidden. It is a fundamental, essential aspect of the movement of abolition, is that belief. Because we are all in the image and likeness of God, we are all of equal dignity. And so the element of prayer, the element of thanksgiving, the element of these two parts, this man who can now take his role, stand up, and this woman who prays. A lot like seeing an image of Jesus in the Last Judgment. You've got Jesus sitting there doing stuff, and you have Mary right next to him who is interceding and praying. So I think it's a very beautiful image. Also, this image was very popular from a medal that went around a great deal during the years of slavery, which were a great symbol of the abolitionist movement, where you have this kneeling woman before the image of justice who says, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" So I just want to point out that there's a really sort of beautifully poignant aspect to that. Now, Lydia Childs, of course, did not like the work. You can see here that she argues about the work from the point of view of art, and she says that she's got her figures are disproportioned. I think she said about Forever Free, the man looks like a sausage, and there's a lot of this kind of disparaging of her art. The thing is that I don't understand is that this is a work by William Wetmore Story, and this work is also aesthetically and by the standards of art, it is filled with flaws. And so the body isn't articulated underneath the robes. The proportions of the hips to the legs is completely off. But we don't hear that kind of criticism of Wetmore Story. I mean, what I'm getting at here is that Edmonia feels a lot of haste to work. But one of the reasons why she's so hasty is because even though people talk about you need to take time, nobody seems to be willing to give her the time to develop, a time that's given to other artists, such as the very famous William Story, who's independently wealthy anyway. So it doesn't really matter if his works are good or not. So I think this argument that she should be sitting around waiting for someday her art to get better is not a particularly valid one, because the way her art gets better, as we will see, is because she keeps making more art. And here we get to what I think is one of my favorite contributions of Edmonia Lewis to the art world. She is a major figure in really putting forward American culture. So again, I want to re-emphasize that she may be an expat, but her roots, and she comes from America, and she doesn't go to Italy and stop being American. She brings the best of our culture, like an ambassador, to Italy. And the reason why I have these in front of me is because these are the world's most famous epics. This is the epic poem of the Odyssey, which then inspired the epic poem of the Aeneid, and then the Divine Comedy by Dante Alighieri, which is he's celebrating a major anniversary this year. And that turned into the first great epic of the fledgling youthful United States when Henry Longfellow wrote the Song of Hiawatha. Longfellow, by the way, is a translator of Dante's Divine Comedy, so make no mistake, this is an epic poem to tell the story of the beauty, the story of America. This is a story. He's going to put himself in the ring with the Greeks, with the Romans, with the Italians, and now the Americans by producing a work of literary art. I can't begin to tell you how important these works are for the creating of a culture of Rome, Greece, and ancient Rome, Greece, and Italy. And Longfellow is putting his best foot forward in creating a common culture, a beautiful language for the United States. And so much so Edmonia will be one of his great ambassadors in Italy, and it will culminate in the fact that she will actually end up doing his portrait, which is today in the Harvard University portrait collection. But she brings that poet to Italy. So think about what she's doing. Think about what an incredibly clever idea this is. The land of the epic poems, the land where we've seen a million images of the Odyssey. We've seen a million images of Aeneas carrying his father out of the burning city of Troy. And how many Paolo and Francescas from the Divine Comedy do we have in the city? She puts forward the narrative of the Hiawatha story, putting together these charming little pairs, groups, in one case, this really ambitious one here of the Indian combat, where you have three figures, and what playing to her own strengths. I mean, again, she does forever free, and the freed woman hears of her, a woman hears of her freedom. She does that from the point of view of her African-American experience. Now she brings out her Native American experience, putting her endorsement on Longfellow's poem with these beautifully, sort of these exquisite little works. The Old Arrowmaker, I think, is a lovely piece. The two are seated, kind of one sort of turns slightly off from the other. Look at the detail that she puts in on the sort of the rough robes and the deer that Hiawatha is thrown down at their feet. Then you have this sort of elegance. This is the neoclassical period, so we have these sculptures tend to be in this period, the taste for sculpture is to be not overly emotional, very clean, very pristine, and she has these elegant figures, this tenderness between Hiawatha and Minnehaha. And then, of course, she even, and this is a woman who's always challenging herself, she even does a combat scene, and combat scenes are incredibly complicated. Poor Caravaggio, when he's trying to paint a combat scene in San Luigi dei Francesi, has to give up and put in 3 or 4 figures. Pollaiolo did a very daring combat scene, and even Edmonia constructs a 3-figure scene that can be seen in the round. So no matter which way you look at it, you see part of the story unfolding. You see this locking of figures. So this is really an example of a woman who is challenging herself and getting better and better and better each time she sets herself a challenge. And I think as a really significant marker of a woman who sees herself as returning culture, sort of if Columbus makes his way to the New World and he brings with it the light of Christianity and the Western culture, here is Edmonia coming back to bring the culture of the New World to the Old World. And so I find this kind of fact that she did this wonderful image of Columbus here. Again, this kneeling figure underneath the robes of Columbus. It sort of has an interesting parallel in that image of the forever free. And again, alluding in part, I suspect, given the fact that it's 1868, alluding in part to the fact that when Columbus talks about his journey, he talks about bringing the light of the faith to the New World. And interestingly, Edmonia's Chippewa people were ministered to by Jesuits. So during her youth, apparently, she had contact with Jesuits, but it was during her time in Rome that she ultimately really found her faith. And so it's interesting to see this image of Columbus bringing the light of the faith, bringing conversion. And indeed, shortly thereafter, we will have the dramatic conversion, or at least reversion, of Edmonia to the Catholic faith. She was in Rome during the pontificate of Pius IX. I think this makes us reflect a little differently on the pontificate of Pius IX. He was surrounded on all sides by the Risorgimento that were about to take over the papal states. But instead of creating a climate of fear and horror, this is a place where these expats could live quite tranquilly right up until the very end. But the most important person, I think, Pius IX also came to visit her in her studio, which of course, came to visit her studio, which is a very, very big affair. And then there is this figure of the third Marquess de Boot, who converted to Catholicism. He's a very famous convert. He's also a ridiculously wealthy man. And so as Edmonia found herself having difficulty with her benefactors in Boston, who were also, on top of everything else, Protestant, she began to find more and more friends in the Catholic community in Rome. And so we have this moment of her baptism, if not reversion, and a certain amount of work that really takes on a religious tone. So, for example, we have her beautiful image of Hagar from 1875. Hagar is a slave of Abraham. When Abraham can't conceive a child with Sarah, his wife, he instead conceived a child with his slave Hagar. Then, when Sarah conceives Isaac, Hagar gets thrown out with her son into the wilderness to die, where she's eventually saved by an angel. And it's a really interesting. It's a very interesting subject for her to be tackling, because this is a woman who is a slave, a woman who is discarded as a slave, but a woman who is then saved by faith, saved by angels, saved by God. So a very interesting and yet indirect and lovely way of addressing the problem of not only slavery, but now the problem of freed slaves. So cast out into the wilderness, disenfranchised, no property, nowhere to go, no jobs. And so she begins to find a voice to talk about the strange feeling of displacement, using these images using an image of Hagar as well as others. She's known for having said she has a strong sympathy for all women who have struggled and suffered. So therefore the attraction to the image of Hagar. But I also think the Virgin Mary is very dear to me. That part of the quote often gets left out when people cite it. And it unfortunately, in the work of Edmonia, very, very few of her religious works have survived. This Christ the Savior was only recently rediscovered in the Butte collection, in a work that she produced for him. We know that she produced a Madonna and Child with Angels that was apparently destroyed in a fire. She produced several other Madonna images, but none of them seem to have survived. And there's one that would sort of be there's the Madonna and Child that would have been part of a Three Magi relief that she produced, but even that was also destroyed. This is a bad photograph because the work was actually destroyed. So unfortunately, although many of Edmonia's works in the Minnehaha or in the Hiawatha series have survived, unfortunately, there's very little left of her religious output, and that is very, very unfortunate. She's a remarkable character, really. I just put I put a little scrapbook together for her. There's her passport over there on the right. She was a woman who went back to the United States, taking these transatlantic trips on boats, basically once a year, to go sell her work. She had to go back to the US, sell her work, produce works, go back and forth, constant running of a business. She had the real responsibilities of being the CEO of the Edmonia Lewis Company, having to worry about getting orders, filling orders, keeping her name out there, making sure she made the right contacts. She had some cases where people refused to pay, or people tried to get out of paying, or she had to take them to court. She, in the unification of Italy, managed to navigate that unification of Italy and participated in an art competition held by the new King of Italy, Victor Emmanuel II, in which she won a medal. And on top of everything else, she continued to challenge herself. That little copy of Michelangelo's Moses shows someone who is constantly trying to hold herself up. She's the girl who doesn't want to be praised. She wants her defects pointed out, and she's willing to face, and she's willing to put her works next to that of the most famous, venerable, untouchable masters to keep trying to become better and better. It's literally like the task of polishing marble, just by rubbing against that pumice against the stone until the stone gets shinier and brighter and more brilliant. And then we get to the most important moment of her life, at least in my opinion, which is the Centennial exhibit in Philadelphia, when there was to be, the United States was going to participate in its first World Expo. The Centennial exhibition held in Fairmount Parkway in Philadelphia was marked by tremendous excitement. So we had pavilions coming in from Japan. There was Thomas Edison. Everything is going on there. But it was also marked by tremendous problems, racial problems, in that there were no Black people who were hired there were no Black people hired to work there. So all these jobs in building new buildings and preparing for a World's Fair, no jobs. given to any of the Black community, and no Blacks were invited to participate. Instead, the sculpture pavilion saw the British show up, the Italians show up, the French show up, so we have kind of like the old world superstars. Edward Bannister had submitted a work called Under the Oaks. This is what we think it looked like. It's not. The work has been lost. He was actually awarded a medal until the jury found out that he was indeed a man of color, at which point they tried to rescind the medal. And then the other work that was made, this is not, Francesco Pezzigar was not of color, but it was a work that was very kind of, a very abolitionist work with the image of the freed slave holding up the Emancipation Proclamation. And that work was criticized and basically panned by all. Now, the decision on the part of Edmonia was to try to enter into this competition. And she obtained a large piece of marble, and she decided to do the subject of Cleopatra. The story, by the way, of how she gets the marble, where she gets the money, it's a very kind of exciting, daring, it's a wonderful story in and of itself. I'll give you some indications for reading afterwards so that you can hear the whole story, but in interest of time, I'm going to leave it out. But she chose Cleopatra. Now, I put in front of you 5 images of Cleopatra, everything from the original medallion made in her own time in ancient Rome, statues that were believed to be Cleopatra, to Elizabeth Taylor, the unforgettable Cleopatra, to the romantics, kind of sexy Cleopatra, to Michelangelo's Cleopatra. This is a subject that everybody loves. So much so that in the World's Fair, there were 6 different Cleopatras that were entered into the exposition. One by another famous woman artist who is Margaret Foley. James Hasseltine did a bust portrait. Thomas Ridgway Gould did a dying Cleopatra. And William Wetmore Story's famous Cleopatra, this had been actually produced a decade earlier, was brought in as the venerable matriarch of all the Cleopatras in the group. So we have 6, actually there were 6 Cleopatras in which Edmonia's stood out. Edmonia produced, in the space of this year of preparation, she got a 2,000-pound piece of marble and carved this immense, it's actually immense, it's a 5'4" statue. And sort of, it must have been amazing to see her standing next to her. I just keep imagining what it must have been like. 5'4", 2,000-pound block of Cleopatra, and standing next to it, the 4-foot diminutive little sculptor who had produced this work with her own hands. I wish I could have been there to see that, see the expressions on people's faces, and to just see that moment of triumph when she succeeded in getting her work accepted, put her work in the exhibition, only to find out that it was a work that caused a great deal of discussion. And I don't think that she was disappointed by that. There were some people who were appalled by it, ghastly, repellent. Oh, look how dead she looks. Other people said it was the most remarkable thing they saw. It excited more admiration than any other work of art. So we see the conversation that she's creating over this body of Cleopatra. So what's the problem with this Cleopatra? Well, the problem looks like this. There are certain types of Cleopatras. In art, when they show Cleopatra, there's usually a few ideas they have in mind. One of the most popular is the idea of the kind of the seductive falling into death, the woman who had seduced Mark Antony, seduced Caesar, and now, since she cannot seduce Augustus, she prefers death. And so we have this sort of voluptuous falling into death. It's a work, Ridgway Gould's work is clearly based on the beautiful Ariadne, which we have in the Vatican museums. This idea of a kind of sensual, collapsing, voluptuous end of life. That's also the one that's also very similar to where Valentine Prinsep went. He was the one painted version of Cleopatra that showed up in the exhibition. And what is more, he was also playing on the fascination that the 19th century had with Egypt. There had been a great deal of excavating in Egypt, exploration in Egypt, and you can see a lot of that interest in the background in this painting. The most interesting of all of them was William Wetmore's stories, which had been made famous many years earlier, several years earlier. We see these classical faces. Thomas Ridgway Gould's has that sort of, the eyes are closing in death, but her face is very, very Greco-Roman. Margaret Foley's face, she basically might as well be a statue of Athena. And William Wetmore's story shows, so here we have a statue of the wounded Amazon for the ideal figure. And the discussion that people were having at the time was wondering about what Cleopatra looked like. Was she Grecian looking or was she African looking? This was a conversation that people were having all the time. And one of the things that William Wetmore's stories, sculpture, was admired for was that it was given this sort of idealized African look, kind of creating the same kind of ideal beauty that the Greeks had created out of the Mediterranean look. Wetmore's story was trying to give that ideal beauty to an African face. And so it was lauded for this new ground. Nathaniel Hawthorne made it incredibly famous. He talks about the full Nubian lips. He talks about this courage, the integrity, the dignity of this figure. What story is trying to show you is the moment that Cleopatra decides to take her own life rather than be enslaved by Augustus. So this is going to be the crux of this argument. The idea of being enslaved by Augustus is repugnant to her. And so we see in the work of Wetmore's story, and we see in the work of Ridgway, an image of Cleopatra who becomes the symbol of the African race refusing to bow to slavery. And so you have, of course, the lovely seductive nature of it, but also this idea of this creating of an ideal heroic type out of Cleopatra. So now let's look at the work that Edmonia throws in. So you have this soft, sensuous drapery of story here, this contemplation of the end of her life, the serpent wrapped around her waist. You have this kind of, a luxurious figure of Ridgway Gould who is sort of falling into eternal sleep. And then you have the big, dead, slumped body of Edmonia in the middle of the work. And there's nothing meant to be seductive about it. Now, do we think that this is because Lydia Child is right and she's not very capable? Or is she trying to tell us something else? So let's look at her decisions here. She's not interested in making the idealized African, but she's also not interested in making the sort of Grecian Hellenistic type. As a matter of fact, Edmonia's face is a little bit closer to the reality. This coin has a portrait of Cleopatra. It's minted in the 1st century BC. And so we see this kind of almost Semitic feature that was prominent on Cleopatra. Furthermore, instead of putting her on this kind of sexy little sort of chaise longue that Ridgway puts her on, we sit her in an imperial throne, a big old throne. And as a matter of fact, the throne is particularly interesting because in 1858, the throne of Khafre had just been discovered. Khafre is one of the pharaohs that commissioned the pyramids. And so you see she's using that sort of Egyptology again, Egyptology that would have been told to her by her friend, Amelia Edwards, who was a travelist and Egyptologist, actually a very, very significant woman traveler and woman travel writer of the day. So we see these elements where she's really working on authenticity. The sandals that look just like these Egyptian sandals that are being dug up out of all over the place. This little feminine touches, the image of the rose or the image of her 2 children, Selene and Helios. She had twin children by Mark Antony. So we see this image of the mother and the serpent, which is still clasped in her hand, even though she is already clearly lifeless. And so you have in this, not this proud queen contemplating suicide, not the sort of sexy, exotic beauty that's kind of fascinating in her death, but you have that awkwardness of death, something that Caravaggio himself had been berated for when he made The Death of the Virgin, and Thomas Eakins' very carnal image of the clinic was actually relegated to another section of the exposition. But she's in the company of other artists who are fearless about showing lifelessness. And what is she remembering about Cleopatra that everybody else seems to forget? What is the most famous slaveholding nation in the entire history of the universe? It is the Egyptians. The Egyptians enslaved Moses's people. Moses had to free his people from slavery. If there has ever been a society that is associated with slavery in the Bible, it's Egypt. And so why make this queen of Egypt, queen of this ultimate slaveholding nation, why idolize her? This idea of this woman, this plantation owner who owned all of Egypt, and all of these people were out there, all those slaves were out there building things in her honor to deify her, to glorify her. So when we look at Edmonia's Cleopatra, it brings to mind the idea of something big and dead, like the idea of slavery. At the time she made this work, slavery was now illegal. But the slavery, the treatment of the people of color, the Black community in the United States, had not really improved. So even though slavery was dead, the big, heavy, lifeless body of Jim Crow laws and discrimination and inability to find work was still sitting there. And that body had yet to be removed. And it became an incredibly powerful way, not to aggressively show the big man who's holding up the Emancipation Proclamation, but to make people talk and think and discuss and wonder. And this is the amazing talent that Edmonia had, an ability to make us think and an ability to make us talk. And now we get to the sort of sad epilogue. It's not actually, there are two epilogues, and the first epilogue is sad. That statue, that thought-provoking, incredible statue, that personal triumph on the part of Edmonia, ended up going to Chicago. And then for another exhibition in Chicago, it just got left there, and then was purchased by someone, by a horse owner whose favorite horse was named Cleopatra. And so it became the tombstone, the Chicago racetrack, for the favorite horse, for the beloved horse, Cleopatra, until it was discovered after extraordinarily painstaking work. And not unlike Cleopatra, Edmonia eventually moved from Rome to Paris and from Paris to London. And there she died in London. And her tomb in Catholic cemetery was also lost. So we have this kind of sad epilogue of this famous work and this incredible achievement and this amazing woman whose tombs are lost. But they have been refound. The Edmonia, the statue of Cleopatra, and the tomb of Edmonia were both found through really the extraordinary efforts of some really wonderful modern scholars. And so we live in a really exciting time to take this figure and put her back up on a pedestal. I think of her in this, I think of her constant insistence in being appreciated for her merits, when I think of how, Martin Luther King in many ways articulated this dream of hers when he gave the I Have a Dream speech in 1963, this dream of being judged on her character, judged on her ability to awaken us, to make us think, to make us feel inspired through her art. And so I just want to end this with a thank you to, first of all, the Sheen Center for Thought and Culture. But I have to admit that when I first started to investigate Edmonia, I ran into a lot of art history and a lot of history of her that I found very problematic and not very, very difficult to understand, and seemed very incomplete. And so I feel this tremendous gratitude, to Albert and Henry Henderson for producing this great body of work. Of course, I was citing Kirsten Pye Buick earlier at the beginning. Oh, no, but the person I wanted to mention in particular is Marilyn Richardson, who is the person who made the effort, the incredible research, really remarkable research. This is like a detective story. She found the tomb of Edmonia Lewis. She found where she was buried, which plot she was buried in, and there's been a wonderful collaborative effort to put the tombstone, that black tombstone I showed you, back on it. And she's also the woman who found the Cleopatra. And so this is an exciting time. This is a time not to despair, but to really see that there's a tremendous effort, people working together to bring out beauty, because this is really, it's a beautiful story of a life, a beautiful artist, and that kind of beauty is the beauty that can save the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Lev, and I couldn't put it any better. I mean, that is the mission, and the aspiration, at least, of the Sheen Center, is to use beauty as that language to engage and elevate culture. We were actually, I see one of our viewers today is actually the town historian of East Greenbush, New York, where Edmonia, I guess, was born. So thank you for joining us. And two quick questions, if I may. One is, where can people who are interested in seeing some of Edmonia's works, I believe you said some of them are featured here in the United States. Where can people see some of her works?
So I put the I put underneath all the works, I put the places, because I was really hoping that since you guys, I think, might be able to move around here in Lazio, we can't move from place to place, but you'll find a great many. For example, the Cleopatra that I was talking about is in the Smithsonian. There are a number. There's the Christopher Columbus is in the High Art Museum in Atlanta, the Cleveland Art Museum, the Metropolitan Museum, Cincinnati Art Museum. So sure, her works are scattered. The Metropolitan Museum in New York, you can find works by Cleopatra. So I put and Howard University outside of Washington D.C. Her works are now beginning to be treasured the way they ought, and placed more in prominent display, taken out of storage and put into. But she's in the major museums throughout the U.S.
And then the other question is, obviously you're Rome-based. I assume a lot of Americans come over there to study art. Are young artists who are pursuing sculpture as their chosen medium, are they aware of Edmonia? Do they study her works, or is she still, unfortunately, not as well known as she should be?
What I find really amazing here is I ran into Edmonia many years ago, looking into things. But I gave a talk on her maybe a couple of years ago here in Rome. And I work with a bunch of guides. I mean, people who are professional guides, and no one ever heard of her. And that's why it was really quite shocking. But mostly it's because her works were, Rome was a very welcoming town, but it's a tough town for work. And as a matter of fact, there's only one woman who ever got a sculpture placed into a public monument. It was Harriet Hosmer, who's a contemporary of Edmonia Lewis from Watertown, Massachusetts. She did the Falconet tomb in Santa Maria del Frate. So most of the works that Edmonia was producing were being produced for export. And so and this is one of the reasons why living in Rome this way was something that kind of worked. It worked very well for her. This is the part that I can tell you as an expat. If you come to Italy and you set up, you set up your life, and you're dealing with people who are back home, so you're kind of the bridge between the United States and Italy. That's kind of your niche. And so the Italians weren't so much looking for sculptures by an American, but Americans loved buying sculptures by the Americans abroad. So she set up a very successful business, but the works were mostly destined to return back to the United States.
Well, thank you. You mentioned early in your presentation that the work of sculpture is to bring these historical figures to life. And thank you for bringing Edmonia Lewis to life for us today. And more importantly, you said two of the things that Edmonia's work and legacy were really known for were her ability to make us think and talk. And while that's certainly clear by her remarkable life story, I think a similar compliment could be made for you and the work you do. So thank you for the ability to make us think, and the ability to make us talk about these remarkable figures like Edmonia Lewis. So thank you very much for sharing this last hour with us. And, I hopefully will be able to do it again in person, but in the meantime, I'm so grateful that we were able to have this digital platform with us. Thank you for staying up late. I know it's late in Rome, so I apologize if I kept you up past your bedtime.
It's past curfew for us.
There you go. Well, thank you so much, and until next time, ciao. And thank you to our viewers. I hope you enjoyed this event as much as we loved making it available to you. We certainly can't do these types of events without your help. So again, we encourage you to like us, subscribe to our Sheen Talks YouTube station, and if possible, we ask you to consider making a donation to the Sheen Center. Whatever gift, no matter how small, makes a huge difference. We also encourage you to check out all our upcoming events at sheencenter.org. And until next time, stay safe, be well, God bless.